Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base Biotech podcast, and this is number 63, going live on June the 12th. It's the time of year here, at least, when you have to navigate by avoiding village summer fairs, because people park wherever they feel like, and the road rage goes up exponentially. Other than that, a pretty quiet week, except when I stepped on the thick end of a USB cable at 3 a.m. Not the only tech casualty this week, though, because my cat chewed through the headphone cord for the third time. Last week, our guest was Revelesio President Greg Archambault about a new way to treat strokes. This week, we have conversations with Mark Sawicki, President and CEO of Cryoport Systems, and with Nick Manusos, CEO of Kenai Therapeutics. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other suggestions or comments, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you want to advertise or sponsor a podcast episode or for event coverage, or, which is the most common, to send me spam telling me my mailbox is full or that my transaction on a credit card that I don't have has gone through. First, it's time to go through some of the headlines of the articles you may have missed over the past week at deeptechdigest.com. There were positive data from a linear IgA disease study, fast-track designation has been given to a Lynch syndrome-associated cancers treatment, and antibody fragments prevent hemorrhages associated with new Alzheimer's treatments. Servier is acquiring Edgewise Therapeutics' muscular dystrophy business. A spinal muscular atrophy treatment has been given FDA breakthrough therapy designation, and a potential best-in-class ADC for sarcoma received orphan drug designation. Data show cardiometabolic benefits of a type 2 diabetes treatment. Biomarker-guided immunosuppression following kidney transplantation has been successfully tested, and a new therapy may reverse autism-related brain deficits. A world's first as a gene therapy delivered a missing gene to an infant's brain. Mitochondria may help immune cells fight bacteria by changing shape. And Sofinova Partners is collaborating with AWS to scale AI in life sciences innovation. And you can read all of these and plenty more at deeptechdigest.com. All right, let's get to this week's interviews, and first up is Cryoport Systems. It's a company that provides temperature-controlled supply chain solutions for the life sciences industry, among other things. And so we got to talk logistics with the company's CEO and president, Mark Sawicki. Hi Mark, really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. First, could you tell us about Cryoport Systems?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just introduce myself, Jim, and then I'll tell you a little bit about Cryoport Systems. So, obviously my name is Mark Sawicki. I'm the CEO of Cryoport Systems, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of the parent company, which is Cryoport Inc. We operate as an operating holding company. So Cryoport Inc. has 3 divisions under it. Cryoport Systems, which is the division I run. MVE, Biological Systems, which manufactures about 70% of the world's stainless steel and cryogenic freezers and dewars, and a biorepository company called Cryogenic. So Cryoport Systems was founded more than 25 years ago by 6 physicians who wanted to identify an easier way to transport and a safer way to transport cryogenic materials. They were thinking about it from a sperm, eggs, and embryo standpoint. But Cryoport Systems today has evolved from really a technology platform to a service company. And so we're really the global leader at this point in temperature-controlled supply chain systems and processes, supporting around 70% of the world's cell and gene therapies, as well as most of the commercial products. animal health vaccine distribution on a global basis for companies like Zoetis. And we also support a significant percentage of the market from the reproductive health standpoint and moving sperm, eggs, and embryos on behalf of intended parents all over the world. Biologistics division, which is really the planes, trains, and automobiles. So we manage all the equipment around the transportation elements, as well as surface fleet and other things to support the distribution of critical irreplaceable materials. We also have a large bioservices business that does all the kitting and storage and fulfillment related activities. We do have a business called Integral, which is a cryopreservation business, which is upstream, which is in essence processing of patient material, so apheresis or leukapheresis material that comes out of a patient prior to manufacturing, and then some other ancillary support mechanisms like a company called Tetramed, which is a condition monitoring company, so all the data side of transportation, and then some other smaller areas.
We're talking a little bit about cell and gene therapy today, but could you give me a bit of a snapshot of where that industry or that sector is right now?
The industry, obviously launched in 2017, really. A lot of folks say it might be a little bit earlier with the Dendreon product, but realistically it was 2017 with the launch of both the Novartis and the Gilead Kite products. Over the last 9 years, we now see a consistent set of approvals coming out of the FDA and European agencies. Typically 3 to 4 products a year now are being launched. But we're moving into a transitional period, I would say, from an emerging market where, you get the first approvals to what I would say is a standardization environment. And so companies have to transition from, great, we have this wonderful, novel technology to address intractable, health issues in the space. We've demonstrated the ability to do it. And now we have to demonstrate the ability to do it effectively at scale on a global basis and more cost effectively. So we're now entering that transitional period where the industry is really looking at a standardization of processes, systems, manufacturing paradigm to drive accessibility, to drive scale, and to drive cost benefit. And so we're moving into providing access into the community care setting, for example, into emerging markets and others.
Are there any bottlenecks that you see in this sector?
Yeah, there's a lot of bottlenecks still. There's still an issue of accessibility. So patient access is a huge issue. The vast majority of the space is being supported by large teaching hospitals. And then so only about 20% of the patient population has accessibility to these therapies today. Companies are moving into trying to drive into community care access as well as emerging market access. Price is still a significant issue in reimbursement. So dealing with the regulatory, governmental agencies, both in the US, Europe, and Asia, to define reimbursement and to address the challenges associated with the change in model. Because what we've done, in essence, here is Cell and Gene is now moving from a chronic reimbursement model, which is you take a pill for the rest of your life, X dollars per pill, and the company's reimbursed, to we have this technology which will cure the disease. The upfront cost is far more expensive than obviously taking a pill for, repeatedly for a period of time, but the overall long-term cost benefit is there. And so the industry, in particular, the HMOs, governmental agencies are trying to determine how to address this long-term. And then the third piece is on standardization. So as we transition from an emerging market to a mature market, we have to address all of the inefficiencies in the process and really drive the standardization across the cell and gene space. And that's what's now, the market is now transitioning into that.
Before we look at what you're doing to help, what are some of the challenges in general with tackling that?
Yeah, so you obviously have to really look at a regulatory consensus. So there's not a regulatory consensus yet in the markets. The FDA has demonstrated, a lot of flexibility around approvals. But there's still a lot that needs to be done from a regulatory standpoint to really drive accessibility of these products over time. And then obviously there's an industry challenge around lack of standardization. So standardization is a huge issue. You have 10 companies with products on the market. They have 10 different processes for addressing this throughout the entire manufacturing process, supply chain process, market engagement process. All of these things are moving into a standardization paradigm. Those have to be addressed. And then obviously the reimbursement issue has to be addressed as well. So those are the biggest challenges currently. The good thing is that the industry is committed to solving those. We're seeing significant activity in conjunction with organizations like Deloitte and others. The Alliance for Regenerative Medicine has significant initiatives around trying to drive standardization and a long-term, efficiency in the space to drive the cost basis down as well.
And so as a company, what are you doing to help move that along?
Cryoport Systems is in a unique position because we supporting over 70% of the clinical space and almost all of the commercial space. We understand where the challenges are from a supply chain standpoint. So what we're doing is we're working with our sponsors as well as the commercial sites to really look at best practices associated with supply chain activities, harmonization of those to eliminate redundancies, to eliminate risk, to eliminate unnecessary spend, to drive the cost of goods down on the products themselves, as well as to enhance accessibility. So a huge initiative right now in the space is to really push into the community care setting. And we have technology to not only allow these community hospitals to store product on site, without building out all these extensive infrastructure to support cryogenic storage of, cell therapy products, for example. So we're working with them to provide the support mechanism for them to be able to bring these therapies into these community care settings, outpatient settings, as well as driving standardization so that the clinical commercial sites don't have to deal with supply chain challenges, and working with this, clinical commercial sponsors to harmonize activities so that there's efficiencies across the network. So standardizing packaging configuration, standardizing data packages, integrating IT systems across the entire spectrum so that you have a continuous, what's called a chain of identity and a chain of custody across all aspects of the process to manufacture these therapies. And so we're working hand in hand with them to do that.
And so are you seeing a gap between successful clinical trials and being able to roll out a product?
Clinical success doesn't always translate to commercial success. So there are therapies that have gotten commercial approval but have not been successful in the market because they have not addressed the reimbursement problem. And so they're struggling to get traction because they didn't really understand the market dynamics and work with the regulatory and the government side of things in Europe for reimbursement, as well as the HMOs in the US and the FDA as it relates to Medicare and Medicaid access. The big challenge right now around a successful commercial product and a marginal commercial product is really those parties that have really defined the market accessibility from a reimbursement standpoint. That's one of the biggest issues right now that they're still working through. And where, you have a company like, let's say, J&J who rolled out Carvykti, or BMS who has Breyanzi and Abecma, they've done a very good job on market access, and they see significant market share, blockbuster products on the market.
You talked about it earlier about cost, and that's been one of the biggest criticisms. Can that be driven down?
Yeah, so we're working very, very closely with the clinical commercial entities to look at cost. We can focus on it from a supply chain standpoint. We don't support the manufacturing process itself, which obviously has significant cost as well. But we've been able to work with companies to identify substantial cost benefit on efficiency around supply chain. And so that means all the management of the product, collection and processing of the starting material, the storage of the material, the distribution of the material, and so we've been working with them hand in hand to drive the costs down substantially for that aspect of it. And we've been very successful. We've been able to work with companies to demonstrate a 50% reduction in cost of goods as it relates to the supply chain. And there's more to go there. So as we continue to mature and standardize process, right? Process standardization is critical to driving down cost. And as I had said, the markets are very, very focused on point. Early on, they were focused on demonstrating efficacy and getting commercial approval. Now they're focused on those commercial approvals demonstrating profitability and cost effectiveness.
How have you had to evolve as the industry changes?
Well, we've spent a lot of time working hand in hand with the industry to really look at best practice. We assisted in writing what is now ISO 2973, which is an ISO standard that really outlines how these materials should be managed in the supply chain. And we actually wrote a big piece of that. So, we work hand in hand with the industry, with the regulatory bodies, as well as these nonprofits to really assist in education, to assist in looking at best practices and to drive that standardization that we're talking about.
Is there a danger at all with some of these complex logistics and supply chain issues that only wealthy countries are going to be able to implement some of these advanced therapies?
I think this follows the same pattern as many therapy classes, right? And so typically when you have a new cutting edge class of therapies, they launch in developed countries first because they have the ability to obviously to support the development of these therapies and to pay for them. What we're seeing now is a transition from United States, Europe, and countries like Japan, which have the ability to pay for it, into more emerging markets. And I'll give you an example of that. So there are now multiple cell therapies that have been approved in India that are manufactured in India itself. So they've actually been able to demonstrate the ability to tech transfer into a far lower cost basis for a manufacturing environment, which has driven the cost down by about 60-70% to manufacture these therapies. And manufacturing in country also eliminates or minimizes a lot of the supply chain challenges of moving product in and out of an emerging market. The process is very early, but it follows similar to what you've seen with most of modern medicine. Is you go from a higher cost base that can support the development, launch, and accessibility, and then as we work through the issues, we transfer manufacturing, we build out domestic supply chain competencies in some of these emerging markets. It does provide the ability for emerging markets to access these therapies over time, and that's just starting to occur now. As I mentioned, India has taken a lead in this, and they have multiple products on the market in India at a far lower cost basis than you would get in the US. The Middle East a lot of the governments in the Middle East are very interested in this, and they're actually sponsoring and supporting activities to bring them in-house. And then looking at other markets like South America, for example, as well as very early stages in Africa to look at accessibility, but that'll take some time. But it'll happen over time.
So you don't think that there's a danger of a two-tier system?
I think you're going to see over time the ability of these therapies to be accessible in emerging markets. That doesn't mean that everybody in that emerging market will have access. They're still expensive. So if you have somebody that's in poverty, their ability to be able to access these therapies in the short term is probably challenged. But I think as the industry continues to mature, one of the things I like about the cell and gene space is they have a tendency to engage regulatory and governments very early and work hand in hand with those governments to define a pathway for accessibility, and that is occurring. So I do think it's a matter of time that accessibility will occur over time.
With things like what's happening in Iran, Lebanon, how do geopolitical issues affect the industry, or are they affecting it?
We don't see any material impacts on what's going on with the geopolitical situation globally. Petroleum is not a huge, you have some transportation impact, but limited. I mean, the cost basis, the transportation aspect of moving these therapies around is typically on a $350,000 therapy, it'll be less than 1% of the cost of it. So even if that goes up 30 or 40% due to some of these issues, it doesn't have a material impact on the accessibility or the cost of the therapy themselves. So there's really no impact from that perspective that we've seen.
How do you keep your finger on the pulse of change and stay ahead of change? I mean, where do you see the industry going and how do you respond?
We're in a very unique position because we are supporting over 70% of the clinical space and most of the commercial space. We see all of the pain points. The companies that we're working with come to us to help identify and solve those problems. It allows us to really understand what needs to be addressed. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the standardization process is one that, the companies are heavily engaged in at this moment in time. They're working through some of those issues right now. Cell and gene will be, we always talk about, if you look at therapy classes, you've got small molecules, which have been around for, 100 years, right? And a very mature market. It's very commoditized, obviously. Companies then moved into biologics, and you're looking at antibodies and injectables. That happened and started in the early 80s, and it really took 25 years for that side of the market to mature. And now some of the largest products on the market today that are successful are biologic drugs, right? And they address a series of targets that small molecules couldn't solve. Well, there's still a whole basket of diseases, genetic issues, and others that still hadn't been accessible that the cell and gene space are now providing accessibility to solving. And so, it's really going to be the third pillar. And we anticipate over a third of the market in 10 years will be cell and gene related. So it'll become a mature third vertical in the pharmaceutical space from our perspective that'll address, a significant number of diseases. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a gentleman that I know who received one of the first treatments, gene therapy treatments for sickle cell anemia. So this gentleman, prior to this, and he's in his late 20s now, he couldn't even walk across the room without being in pain and having to sit down. He climbed Kilimanjaro last year. This is a genetic disease, sickle cell anemia, that they're able to cure a genetic disease. I mean, the ability for somebody who couldn't even walk across a room to climb Kilimanjaro, that shows you the power of these therapies over time. So it's a very powerful story, I think, and seeing him really, his life went from not having a life to being able to do anything that anyone else has been able to because it cured a genetic disease. It's just spectacular.
As far as your company's concerned, what are you looking to in the near future as some of the things that you'll be able to help with and maybe some of the challenges that you can help overcome?
Over the next couple of years, what we're really focused on is accessibility. So working with our clinical commercial partners to drive accessibility of these therapies into the community care setting so that we can go from in the US having 20% of the population of the US having access to these therapies to more than 75%. So that's one piece that we've been working hand in hand with is to drive accessibility for these therapy classes, then obviously cost and standardization. So we're working on all three of these things with many partners today.
I enjoy those wide-ranging interviews, and it's also good to get perspectives not only from the drug developers but also other parts of the entire ecosystem. Now let's switch to Parkinson's disease and a conversation with Nick Manusos, CEO of Kenai Therapeutics, about the progress of their treatment. Hi Nick, it's great to talk to you about your work. I wonder if you could maybe set the scene with a bit of background on the company.
Absolutely excited to tell you the Kenai Therapeutics story. Let me first start out with our goal. The goal of Kenai Therapeutics is we're a neuron cell replacement therapy company for Parkinson's disease. And the goal of Kenai is to restore what Parkinson's disease has stolen from patients. See, Parkinson's disease destroys neurons in the brain, destroys dopamine producing neurons in the brain, and thereby causes some of the symptoms or traditional or stereotypical symptoms that you would see with a patient that has Parkinson's or an individual that has Parkinson's disease, such as tremor and rigidity. And our goal is to turn back the clock on the disease by replacing those lost dopamine producing neurons in the center of the brain and improve the lives of those individuals with Parkinson's. So that's the goal. And again, I talked a little bit about how we do that by replacing the neurons in the brain that Parkinson's destroys. So that's the mission / goal of the company. The history of the company is we're a spin out of a company called Fujifilm Cellular Dynamics, a global, world-renowned induced pluripotent stem cell company. I used to be chief operating officer of that company, and I was CEO of a majority-owned spin-out. So this is the third successful program to be spun out of Fujifilm Cellular Dynamics. One program was in immune oncology. where the company and Fujifilm Corporate got together with a very prestigious venture capital company and created Century Therapeutics, leveraging the immuno-oncology backbone technology from cellular dynamics. Second was I was CEO of a majority-owned spin-out called Opsis Therapeutic. That was photoreceptor replacement therapy for disease of the retina. That we partnered with Bayer Blue Rock, and that is in the clinic as well. So this is the third program to come out of Fujifilm Cellular Dynamics, and this is for Parkinson's disease. And we spun it out in early 2022. In 3 years, we took that program, which was pre-IND, if you will. Cellular Dynamics had done some extensive lead optimization work, really high quality lead optimization and preclinical work. But we took that program at that stage. And in 3 years, Kenai Therapeutics brought that program to the clinic. And we are in the middle of a phase 1b, 2a open label trial as we speak. So we've accomplished regulatorily in 3 years, cleared the IND, moved into a phase 1b, 2a trial. We scaled up the manufacturing process enough to manufacture enough product for the trial that we're in right now and begin the scale up process for the future. We've raised almost $100 million in dilutive and non-dilutive funding since the company was born in early 2022. And we have a great syndicate of investors led by the $82 million Series A in 2024 that's funding our current trial, by the Column Group, co-led by Cure Ventures, the Alaska Permanent Fund. So all of those members sit on our board. So that's the company. We've got a great mission, we've got a great history, and we've got great investors, and we've accomplished a lot in a very, what we think is not a long period of time. So we're off to the races.
What was the initial motivation for going into that Parkinson's space?
Cell therapy uniquely, and I think when I was at Fujifilm Cellular Dynamics, cell therapy has some unique applications. Today, we're seeing it in CAR T, we're seeing it in type 1 diabetes, and as I mentioned previously, diseases of the retina, and in Parkinson's disease, where replacing damaged cells, where the cell replacement therapy has the promise of impacting disease. So in this particular case, too, there's a big unmet need in Parkinson's disease today. For decades, individuals with Parkinson's are only offered symptom managers, if you will. Therapies called levodopa and carbidopa, which are excellent symptoms manager, but their efficacy wanes over time. Then they begin to suffer those symptoms over longer periods each day. Parkinson's is an unrelenting disease. So cell therapy in Parkinson's, and by the way, we believe it's been de-risked. Cell therapy in Parkinson's been de-risked. We're not the only company pursuing Parkinson's. We're different than everybody else in Parkinson's, cell therapy for Parkinson's disease. But cell therapy itself has now been proved to be a safe approach based on early clinical studies and showing early signs of promise for those individuals with Parkinson's disease as well. So Parkinson's disease is one of those areas that lends itself well to cell therapy.
You mentioned being different to other companies in the space. What is it that sets you apart?
Yeah, thank you. It's multifaceted, but it all centers around our cells. Back in that early development days at Fujifilm Cellular Dynamics, they invested a lot of time in optimizing the process of creating the neurons. They optimized that process for what we would call potency. Potency is important because highly potent cells will manufacture dopamine, and then those cells will connect with each other and create a synapse. And that connection actually generates the best efficacy or innervation / dopamine production. So Fujifilm Cellular Dynamics optimized for potency. They would tweak what we call the differentiation protocol, or the manufacturing protocol, if you will. They would tweak it and then test it, and tweak it and test it at Dr. Jeff Cordover's lab when he was at Rush, which wasn't far away from Fujifilm Cellular Dynamics, and they optimized it for potency. And in preclinical testing, those results of that early development were in the early IND enabling studies, preclinical studies, proved that hypothesis to be true in preclinical models, that our cells are more potent. And we're hoping that that's going to translate into human studies that we've embarked on right now. So we start with our cells. Our cells are different, and they've been optimized for potency. And then what we did at Kenai is we built this powerful ecosystem around our cells. So we have Cellular Dynamics. We have them as a world-class manufacturer of our products. CMC, or manufacturing in cell therapy, is not easy. To do it in a consistent, reproducible manner. We've solved for that. Our process is locked, and we have a very consistent, reproducible product, if you will. We've got this world-class manufacturer of cells, of induced pluripotent stem cells, differentiated induced pluripotent stem cells for us. The second part of the Kenai ecosystem is we've partnered with a company called ClearPoint Neuro. And ClearPoint Neuro is the gold standard in delivery. We need to deliver these cells to the center of the human brain. We need to do that in a safe and precise manner as possible. The device we're using from ClearPoint Neuro allows us to do that using MRI technology and enables that precise delivery exactly where we want those cells to be. And then the final piece of the ecosystems is the center of excellence, those very prestigious centers of excellence that we've partnered with for our phase 1b/2a trial, such as University of Arizona Banner, USC, University of Southern California, The Ohio State University. All of these surgeons and these centers have experience in cell and gene therapy. They're very good at what they do. We didn't just take for granted that we had the best cells. We built the ecosystem around the cells. We're nimble, flexible company that's partnered with top tier partners, all backed by those great investors that I mentioned as well. We've also benefited from a funding standpoint. We've received and been lucky enough to receive 2 awards from CIRM, California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. So we've got some great partners and a great ecosystem that we've built around these cells. The final thing that sets us apart is we do have the benefit of being I would call it a fast follower. We've watched and learned from the few companies. There's a couple of companies that are in front of us that we've been able to watch and learn from. So, for example, surgical approach, where and how to deliver the cells to the center of the brain and how to optimize the surgical approach. The fact that our cells are allogeneic, off-the-shelf, cryopreserved version. There's some companies that are autologous, for example. Autologous, I think, will have a place for certain patients, but there's 90,000 new patients every year in the United States alone. Autologous is going to have a hard time reaching those patients in a cost-efficient manner. We have an off-the-shelf, cryopreserved, allogeneic solution that we believe will benefit the most patients, the most individuals with Parkinson's disease. We can reach the most of them. So a lot of different ways that we're different, all centered around those highly potent cells.
You mentioned some of the drugs that treat the symptoms but not the cause. How much more difficult is it to develop treatments that are addressing the cause?
So the challenges with cell therapy, as I mentioned earlier, historically from the experience of the other companies in spaces, for example, CMC, a manufacturing process that consistently delivers a high quality, very reproducible cells. That's not easy to do. Many companies have challenged with either developing the process or the cost of developing that process has been prohibitive for companies and had challenges with it. We've de-risked that. I don't have to build a $100 million plant and fill it with people. I have a partner who's already built the plant. As a matter of fact, they just expanded their capacity in Madison and built another commercial plant. So we don't have to do that. We don't have to tech transfer from an academic lab to a third-party CDMO and from a third-party CDMO. The program is being manufactured where, if you will, it was born. So we've de-risked the manufacturing approach. And the other thing that's challenging to do in cell therapy is to build that ecosystem around it, the high quality centers of excellence, the methodology to deliver to the center of the brain. So we believe we've solved for the hard parts, and the ecosystem solves for a lot of the hard parts. That said, cell therapy is no different than classic pharmaceutical drug development. There's inherent risk. And whether it's small molecule, large molecule, or cell therapy, there's inherent risks in everything. But we believe we've solved for many of the challenges that go with cell therapy development.
So could you tell me a bit more about the treatment and how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way RNDP 001, as I mentioned, it's an off-the-shelf allogeneic cryopreserved neuron cell replacement therapy. So we start our cells are, if you will, in a cryopreserved in a vial. We reconstitute those cells prior to delivering them to the center of the brain. We create a formulation of those cells. Then the patient is put under anesthesia, and the surgeon uses that ClearPoint neuro device, or that cannula, to deliver the cells to the center of the brain, to the putamen in our particular case, exactly the specific spots in the putamen that we're targeting. And we have very specific spots in the putamen that we're targeting for a variety of reasons and trying to optimize for coverage and location. Certain parts of the putamen have, for example, an impact on cognition. Our hypothesis is that it has an impact on cognition, and we're trying to place cells at all the strategic points within the putamen. So we deliver those cells, those reconstituted cells, to the center of the brain, and then the patient comes off anesthesia and depending on the recovery process, goes home shortly thereafter. In our phase 1b/2a trial, we will be continuously monitoring the patients for 5 years because this is a safety trial. But we will check at various time points along the way to make sure the patient is doing well and capture any improvements that we hope the patient's actually benefiting from the cell therapy.
Could you tell me a little bit more about the clinical trials and the pathway what way you're at on that pathway?
Sure. So we announced last December, very conservatively, in a press release that we had treated our first patients in our phase 1b/2a open label trial designed for safety. And we have progressed well since then. We were actually very conservative when we announced that. We'd actually started sometime before that, but we wanted to make sure, abundance of caution, that everything had gone well. So we're tracking on that trial that I mentioned. We call it the replace trial, because we believe that from a mechanism of action standpoint, we call it the replace trial because what cell therapy will do, first we'll replace what was lost, then we'll repair the neurotransmission, and then we'll restore function. So we call it the 3 R's. So the replace trial is the first R in those 3 R's. So that's a 12-patient trial broken into cohorts of low dose, high dose, and best dose. We are progressing well in that trial and targeting in the very near future. We hope to announce that we will have completed enrollment, and then as we committed in our press release in December, later this year, we will begin to share the results of how patients are doing, both from a safety standpoint, which is the primary goal of the study, but secondarily, we are checking these patients for improvements in how they feel, both from a diary and an assessment standpoint. So in Parkinson's disease, one of the ways we capture, and one of the important ways in which we capture improvement, is what we call on time and off time. We establish a baseline of on time means what part of every day the patient feels good or better, and off time means when they don't feel good or their medications that we talked about previously are starting to wear off. We want to see improvements in on time and off time, even though the trial's not designed as a primary endpoint to see that. We're hoping to see some signals of improvement for how patients are feeling. Improvement, more time feeling better, less time feeling not better. And we're tracking that. And that is one of the things that we're hoping to see, that these highly potent cells that in preclinical models that translates into human benefit as well. That'll be the phase 1b/2a trial. Next, will be our phase next trial, which we're already starting to think about and plan about what's possible. As I mentioned, we're a fast follower. There's a couple of companies faster than us that have been benefited from publicly announcing that together in collaboration with the FDA, they've been permitted, if you will, to go faster. And by going faster, to go from this safety trial right to a registrational or pivotal trial. We're hoping that our clinical data, that translates for us as well. And if it does, we're planning for success. So we're already preparing, if you will, both from a CMC and a clinical standpoint for that possibility. What we're hoping is that possibility to go from where we're at today and wrapping up this current safety trial and moving potentially to a registrational trial. We're also looking from a clinical standpoint at other countries like Japan, who embrace regenerative medicine, have a strong rate. There's a lot of innovation that comes out of Japan. There's an unmet need in Japan from a Parkinson's standpoint as well. So we're ramping up our efforts to pursue a regulatory and clinical path in Japan as well.
Does early diagnosis make a difference in how effective your R&DP 001 can be?
So in our current trial, we're targeting what we call moderate to moderate severe patients. Translation, what that means is individuals that have had the disease for maybe 5 to 7 years, and their current treatments, if you will, the symptom managers you and I have discussed, the efficacy of those is starting to wane. So we're targeting that patient population. In general, early diagnosis of any disease, much less Parkinson's, because Parkinson's is just this unrelenting disease with high unmet need. The daily tasks that we take for granted every day, like going across the room and grabbing the TV remote or brushing your teeth, are a challenge for these patients. So early diagnosis of any disease, including Parkinson's, and managing these patients is good because especially if you don't know what's causing your challenges, and we can get them on, because symptom managers work early. They work well early. They just don't work forever, and that's where we come in. But back to early diagnosis. Yeah, it would be good for Parkinson's and in general for early diagnosis. For us, we're going to focus on initially treating those individuals who've already been on the early symptom manager treatment based on this trial. But in the future, the promise of cell therapy remains to be seen as to whether earlier diagnosis or patients with earlier onset can be treated. We'll see. But right now, we're focusing on the patients that I described previously. But I'm always cheering for early diagnosis for anyone, especially where there's strong unmet need.
What are your ultimate hopes for people with Parkinson's? Are you anticipating being able to stop it in its tracks, reverse some of the symptoms?
I've talked about turn back the clock in cell therapy, and we're unique within cell therapy, as you and I have been talking about. Cell therapy offers the opportunity to turn back the clock to a time when the patient was able to perform daily tasks. Again, the things you take for granted, just getting up, walking across the room, and using a TV remote. The little things in life that now an individual with Parkinson's treasures. We want to turn back the clock back to that time when they were able to function in life. That's what we're hoping to do. That might not be exactly the same thing for every individual, but what we hope for every individual that we treat is it turns back the clock to a time when they're feeling better. As with all treatments, small molecule, large molecule, or cell therapy, different individuals will experience varying degrees of that, but we're hoping that all individuals feel that turn back the clock. And that's what we're monitoring for. We're monitoring from a clinical assessment standpoint. There's a standard rating scale used by movement disorder neurologists called the Movement Disorder Society UPDRS, United Parkinson's Disease Rating Score, and that's well understood. We're measuring before we start treatment and after we're hoping to see improvements there, improvements in their diary, and just general, they just quote unquote feel better. That's what we're hoping for.
Very good. Yeah. Is there anything else that you're working on?
Yeah, so we have a pipeline. It's earlier in development. So we break Parkinson's down into two larger categories, the idiopathic and inherited forms of the disease. And about 90% of patients have the idiopathic form of the disease, which is what we're treating with our lead program today in that phase 1b/2a trials, idiopathic patients, RNDP001. There are inherited forms of the disease, different, much smaller, in some cases, patient populations. For example, we have an open IND to treat individuals with autosomal recessive forms of the disease. These patients present much, much earlier. You were talking about early diagnosis. Here's a patient population that presents as early as maybe even as in their 20s. They could present symptoms with the disease, and therefore early diagnosis in this very small patient population would be really important. And we have an open IND to treat these patients, and we're hoping to start that trial in the very near future. We also have in our pipeline plans to edit the lead program, gene edit the lead program. One program where we plan to edit, the benefit that we're hoping to achieve with this program is through the edit, it will secrete a protein that not only will we replace what's been lost with Parkinson's patients, but it will also protect the remaining cells that are still in the putamen. So it's a combination of replacing and protecting. And then there's another program in which we're planning to perform multiple edits to address the needs of one of the more common forms of inherited, the most common form of inherited forms of the disease. And then we have a further combination therapy product to address inflammation. So yes, to answer your question, we have a pipeline that we're pursuing. We're part of our team that is performing and working on the pipeline. Our R&D centers in San Diego. We're part of Lilly Gateway Labs. We're honored and proud to be part of Lilly Gateway Labs in San Diego, where our R&D center is. And that's where that team of editors and developers and performing preclinical studies and early CMC development, all of that is in our wonderful, wonderful site in San Diego.
Nick was kind enough to redo that interview after our first one had the kind of technical gremlins that should have been confined to the past. But now I have a new internet provider, and it may never happen again until the next time. I also love how when you restart your computer these days, it does updates on certain programs, and they always seem to reset and you lose the setup that you worked very hard to figure out. But minor complaints. The World Cup is here, and the person who spent 2 hours at my house installing that new internet service talked about nothing else. And he told me all the scores from the games in advance, and that also included who Scotland would beat in the final. And he went through all of the Scotland players, explaining why they are the best player in the world at their position. And he also gave me his unbiased opinion on referees, which was very interesting, seeing as I used to be a level 1 referee. My son's school today actually is having a Wear a National Football Shirt Day, or soccer, and while he was born in Canada and lived in the US and England, and now lives in Scotland, he asked me what jerseys I had, and as I do have a bit of a collection, I gave him about 15 different options to choose from, and he chose England. In a Scottish school. I know he's already 6'3", but it is a brave choice, and he hates confrontation. Oh well, so if you're watching the World Cup, I hope you are able to enjoy it. So that's it for this week's podcast. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities, or if you want to advertise, please feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. So until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening. And I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.